Gralow, Teen Survivor Northwest founder.
Hi, good morning everyone. It's great to see you all here, and this is on. So I was asked this time to talk about 20 years defying cancer and to try to intertwine the progress that's been made in cancer research and cancer treatment in the past 20 years, a bit with the history of Team Survivor Northwest over the past 20 years. So that's what I'm going to try to do in this talk. And I love the logo, the Defy Cancer, which is new for Team Survivor. So 20 years defying cancer. In 2015, there are more people surviving cancer than ever before, all of you in the room. Currently, the statistics are that 2/3 of people diagnosed with any kind of cancer, all cancers lumped together, will live at least 5 years after diagnosis. And in the 1970s, that was 50% at best. And 5-year survival rates for certain cancers, like breast cancer, testicular cancer, and certain childhood cancers, are currently over 90%. So we've made some major strides. And this curve shows 5-year survival. It starts in 1975 at less than 50%, and it shows it goes out to 2009 here because the statistics are always many years behind in order to clear up how many diagnoses, how many deaths, etc. So it goes out to 2009, where it's about 67%. In the past 20 years, U.S. cancer death rates had dropped about 20%. And up until the early to mid-90s, we had a trend upward in cancer deaths. This is all cancers added together in this country. And then in the early to mid-90s, we started to see a decrease. And this curve right here, the red, is cancer deaths going down, starting in 1990 and going out to about 2010. And what you also see happening at the same time, and it makes sense, is that we have more and more cancer survivors, more people living with cancer in the U.S. That's what these bars are on this graph. So while deaths go down, survivors go up. So earlier detection and better treatments are both contributing to the improved survival, and strides in cancer prevention have also further decreased the burden of the disease, and will even more so in the future. We'll have less cancers diagnosed in the future as well. So to kind of give the big picture view of highlights of cancer progress, if you'd like to look at this in detail, the American Society of Clinical Oncology has a website that is www.cancerprogress.net. Put that address on the bottom of the page, and they go through the whole timeline of all of the achievements. And every year they issue a report on clinical cancer advances in the past year, and they pick out all the highlights too. And that might be of interest to some of you. So here's what they say about cancer progress in general. With respect to surgery, today's cancer surgeries are more precise, less disfiguring, and have fewer complications and long-term side effects than in the past. So we've made strides in surgery. Drug therapy. We have more than 170 drugs approved in cancer today, and most of them were approved just in the last 10 years. Okay? Radiation therapy. We have now advanced technologies that allow radiation to be tailored to the tumor type, the size, the location, and this not only improves survival, but maybe even more importantly, minimizes the risk of serious side effects. We have much more tailored 3D approaches where we don't get as much scattered to the normal tissues. We have multidisciplinary treatment now. And most patients diagnosed with cancer will at least have consideration of some combination of surgery, radiation therapy, and drug therapy. And all of those taken together can extend survival and offer the best chance for cure. In many parts of the world, surgery is still the only treatment of cancer, even in 2015. And then side effect management. It took us a lot of years to feel like that would be a focus. You know, we were spending so much time doing research with all these toxic drugs, and then all of a sudden it kind of kicked in that a drug could be better if it were equally effective but less toxic. So that was kind of a change in strategy, that we didn't need each successive drug being tested or each type of surgery to actually be better in terms of recurrences, because it could also be a winner if it was less toxic. And that's a new concept, really, in the whole treatment of cancer. Okay, and the FDA doesn't really have a good approval strategy for that still. You know, they want the next drug to be better. And better means less recurrences, or does. Or, you know, it doesn't mean less side effects. So that's still complicated. But we do have better ways of managing nausea, pain, and other side effects. Okay. This is a really fun address to read. Dr. George Sledge is a medical oncologist, now heads the cancer program at Stanford, and he was the president of the American Society of Clinical Oncology in 2011. And he's just a really smart guy and has this really great sense of humor as well. And so he gave a great address, and I put the very long website link, which I can give you. I don't expect you to be able to even see that, much less copy it down. But he did his presidential address when he was ASCO president on the history of cancer treatment. And he defined it kind of as we moved through 4 eras. In the 19th century, it was all about local and regional treatment of cancer. Surgery and then radiation. In the late 1940s to 1950s, we started developing systemic total body approaches, but they were very non-specific to the cancer. Basically, they worked on every cell that was trying to divide. The past decade has been targeted therapies. That just exploded in the past decade. And we're just entering a 4th era, which we're calling the genomics era. Okay? We'll go into some of that. So this is a timeline that I kind of modified off of that cancerprogress.net website. And I'm going back more than 20 years, but just to put this a little bit in perspective. So 1846 was the advent of general anesthesia, which really started allowing surgeries. Okay? And since my husband is an anesthesiologist, I put that in as the start of war on cancer. In 1894, the radical mastectomy was first introduced as a treatment for breast cancer. And that was a really aggressive, big surgery where we took the pectoral muscle, all the lymph nodes, and it was really debilitating, but we were getting cures from it. And then in 1903, we had the first use of radiation to treat cancer. Now, the picture of Marie Curie here, who was part of that discovery. She got 2 Nobel Prizes for it. And I put her picture in because I think she is such an amazing woman and role model that I named my dog after her. And Curie is she's not sitting here with us right now, but Marie Curie was really amazing in where we are today with cancer. So this was, as Dr. George Sledge defined, the local regional era, right? Surgery and radiation just targeted to where the cancer was. Then in 1937, in the US, the National Cancer Institute was established. Okay, so we had a commitment from our government to battle cancer, and within the National Institutes of Health, we established one institute focused on just cancer. And between 1940 to 1960, during that era is when we found that you could either take out the ovaries or radiate them and improve breast cancer outcomes in premenopausal women. So we showed there was something to do with ovarian production of estrogen that could, if you eliminated it, improve outcomes in breast cancer. We didn't know what the estrogen receptor was, we didn't understand what it was, but we were starting to see benefits. In 1945, pap smears were first kind of brought into clinical practice. And these are atypical cells on a pap smear. Dr. Gralow invented this. And actually, this is a long time ago now, we started doing pap smears and we reduced pretty quickly cervical cancer incidence by finding atypia, pre-cancer, and acting on it before cervical cancer went all the way to becoming cancer. In 1947 was the first ever remission of a cancer, a pediatric leukemia from drug therapy. And then in 1949, the first chemotherapy drug was approved for cancer. That's 1949. And it was nitrogen mustard. Like, we were using this in the war as, a toxin, and they found out that this actually worked against cancer cells. So we don't use that anymore as chemotherapy, but it was the first drug approved for chemotherapy for cancer. So now we're in the era of non-specific systemic approaches. Okay? We're doing things that have effect on all the cells in our body, but we're getting, because cancer cells tend to divide and grow fastest, we're getting a differential effect on the cancer cells versus the normal cells. Okay. The 1950s to 60s was when smoking was first linked to cancer. Before that, we didn't know that. And so this began smoking cessation campaigns, which we could argue still have not been entirely successful, but this is where we first saw the link between smoking and cancer. And then in the late 1960s to early 1970s, we started developing colon cancer screening, where, kind of like with the pap smear where we found atypia and dysplasia before the actual cancer developed, with the colon cancer screening, we would find polyps before they actually developed into cancer and remove them, because colon cancer is a very slow progression. And that was the late 60s, early 70s. And then in 1971, in Nixon's regime, the National Cancer Act became law, and this is where we kind of said we were starting a war on cancer. And a lot of people don't like that term, the war on cancer, but others do, because it shows we're committed to a fight against an enemy. So now in 1974, doxorubicin or adriamycin is shown to be active against advanced or metastatic breast cancer. And then a couple years later, we proved that giving chemotherapy after surgery in early stage breast cancer reduces recurrences and deaths. That was in the mid-70s. In 1977, breast-conserving surgery was shown to be equal to mastectomy in early-stage breast cancer. So now we've gone from that Halsted radical mastectomy to a modified radical mastectomy to consideration of lumpectomy. It was not too long after that when, as a med student, I remember I did a rotation back at the National Cancer Institute, and Nancy Reagan was diagnosed with breast cancer, and she was flown over to be treated across the street from the National Cancer Institute at Bethesda Naval Hospital. And I remember the big discussion, because she could have had a lumpectomy and she chose a mastectomy. And the very fledgling breast cancer advocacy community that wasn't very vocal at the time was kind of mad at the time that she wouldn't kind of choose the lumpectomy to make a statement, to the nation. So that was kind of, an interesting time. But people were still scared of doing less than a full mastectomy then. And then in 1977, we had the first endocrine treatment approved for metastatic breast cancer, tamoxifen. We have no idea how it worked. It's really, retrospectively, the first targeted therapy in cancer, but it wasn't designed because we understood the estrogen receptor and we designed a drug against it. It was pretty much just an accident that it worked. And then later we figured out how it worked. And this is, now we have lots of drugs that target the estrogen receptor, which is in the nucleus of about 75 to 80% of breast cancer cells. We have not just tamoxifen, which is a SERM, a selective estrogen receptor modulator, but we have a SERD, a selective estrogen receptor downregulator, fulvestrant. We have aromatase inhibitors. They shut down postmenopausal estrogen production, which comes in directly through the adrenal. And then we have in premenopausal women the opposite, ovarian suppression, with shots that shut down your ovaries or removal of the ovaries. So the approval of tamoxifen really led us to better understand the whole connection between estrogen receptor and breast cancer. In the late 1970s, we had growing use of mammography, which led to earlier detection of breast cancer and reduced deaths. Still some controversy over exactly when you should start, how often you should do it, but everybody's in agreement that the randomized trials of doing mammography or not reduce deaths due to breast cancer. That's not an argument. It's just how do we, what age, how often, etc. And then in the 1970s and 1990s, and I give a big gap here because there were lots of papers published in this time, but finally we really showed a link between not just typical skin cancers, the basal cell and squamous cell, and sun exposure, but melanoma, which is a very serious skin cancer, was also linked to sun exposure. And we still have the issue of the tanning beds and all of that going on even now. In 1981, we had our first cancer vaccine, hepatitis B. And liver cancer is not a big cancer in the United States, but it is in many parts of Asia, and this was a very important vaccine, where we showed actually a connection between infectious diseases and cancer. Okay, we really hadn't shown that, up until then, that an infectious disease could actually cause a cancer. Hepatitis B virus could cause liver cancer. In 1986, secondhand smoke was formally called a carcinogen. And so that started the whole ban on smoking in indoor places, because we could say not just it's a matter of choice, you can smoke or not, that's your personal choice, but you're harming other people when you smoke around them. So that allowed us to start banning smoking in indoor environments. And in 1986, there were some important global guidelines developed to ensure proper pain management in cancer patients and the access to opioids and all of that. Up until that point, we hadn't really addressed the pain associated with terminal cancer. Between 1985 and 91, we showed that adding chemotherapy after surgery in some early stage colon cancers reduced recurrences of deaths. That was a big finding, and we weren't doing that before the late 80s, early 90s. And then in 1989, we developed growth factors for red blood cells and white blood cells that allowed us to better get chemotherapy in at full doses safely, so that we could keep the white cells up and infection risk was less, we could keep the red cells up, so that fatigue and anemia was less. So that was about when the growth factors started coming out. Interestingly, we now have our first, in the US, approved biosimilar of a white blood cell growth factor. These are biologics, so you can't call them generics because they're not processed like a standard drug is processed. They're processed inside Chinese hamster ovary cells. So that's called a biologic. And we didn't have an approval process up until just now. I mean, this drug is going to be approved probably next month. We didn't have an approval process for when biologics went off patent. How do we get generic so that the price drops dramatically? And we do now. Europe kind of led the way, and now we're about to have approval of our first, technically generic, but we call it a biosimilar, and it's a white cell growth factor. So lots of stuff behind the scenes, going on. So in the early 1990s, so now we're getting up to close to the 20-year time period I was actually asked about. Cancer deaths began a steady decline in the U.S. And so you can see that here between 1970 and 1991, every year we had more cancer deaths. It was a slow upward trend of 1% to 2% per year. And then in the early 1990s, we started to see this drop in cancer deaths in the U.S., which continues to this day. So 1990 was kind of the tipping point. So we still had an increased incidence of cancer in general, but we were having overall less deaths. So in 1991, powerful anti-nausea drugs were approved, so making it easier to take chemo. When I was in my residency training in the late 1980s, I remember that we would admit patients for virtually all chemo, because we didn't have much chemo and it made people really sick. And there was a drug called cisplatin that we gave that if you were the intern and you're supposed to go see your patients quickly, early in the morning before you do rounds with your attending, if you had a patient who came in and got cisplatin overnight, you knew not to go in and wake them up to see how they were doing because they vomit on you. I mean, cisplatin is so toxic in terms of nausea. And so 1991, we started to have some really good nausea drugs approved that made us able to give drugs even like cisplatin, which we still give today in the outpatient setting. The biopsy technique was developed for melanoma. It was expanded later, several years later, to breast cancer. And that was, now we're entering the era where we're trying to make the therapies we have less toxic. So better nausea drugs, and then less surgery needed for a majority of patients so that the complications long term would be less because you don't need to remove as many lymph nodes. And then in 1992 we had paclitaxel or Taxol, first approved for ovarian cancer, and then a couple years later in breast cancer. Before that time, we basically had very few chemo drugs. And now, 1992, 1994, we have approval of a totally new class of very effective chemo agents in ovarian and breast cancer. The mid-1990s, we had the first proof that some cancers were genetic. I mean, really, people didn't believe Mary Claire King, who now, she started her career at Berkeley, collected families that had lots of breast and ovarian cancer, tried to find the link. And before this time, people didn't really believe that cancer was genetic, or could be genetic. And so this is Mary Claire King, my colleague, a professor of genetics at the University of Washington. And just as a fun side note, if you don't know about it, there's a movie that was released last year called Decoding Annie Parker that is about a woman in Canada whose family all has cancer. She's getting breast cancer, and she's also fighting nobody believing her that cancer can be genetic and run in families at the same time that Mary Claire is discovering the BRCA1 gene. And so it's kind of this woman's story with her family and then Mary Claire racing against the clock, to find the BRCA1 gene. And Helen Hunt plays Mary Claire King. So it's kind of a fun movie. They showed it at the Seattle International Film Festival a year or two ago. And I think what they mainly are doing with it right now is they're allowing it to be used for fundraisers and stuff when they show it. So it's kind of a fun movie. Because there's some science and lots of stuff. You can really go back to that time. So, 1995, Team Survivor Northwest was founded. 20 years ago this summer, it was founded. So this is some of the women who are crossing the finish line at our first Danskin Women's Triathlon. So you can see there's Lisa Talbot, who is one of the co-founders, and got suckered into doing the triathlon as well by one of my patients, but it was great. And Julia Kanyas, who was our first executive director. I don't think you can see where I'm pointing with the arrow. But anyway, so this is when Team Survivor Northwest was founded. So shortly thereafter, in 1997, we had the approval of our first targeted therapy in cancer. So we're now entering what Dr. George Schled said was the targeted era of therapy against cancer. So the first targeted therapy was rituximab, or Rituxan, for lymphoma. And it was against a molecule on the surface of many lymphomas. So this got approved. And then the next year, we had our first targeted breast cancer drug approved, trastuzumab, or Herceptin, which targets HER2, which is only found on about 20 to 25% of breast cancers. So it was approved for metastatic disease in 1998, and then it took quite a while to do the studies to show that it also, in early stage breast cancer, reduced recurrences and deaths. That wasn't approved at early stage until 2006. In 2001, we had a targeted agent to BCR-ABL that transformed the care of chronic leukemia, and that drug was imatinib or Gleevec. And then in 2003 and 2004, we had some targeted therapies for lung cancer, which have since been approved in colon cancer and other cancers, targeting the epidermal growth factor receptor. And this shows you a cancer cell with HER2 molecules on the surface, the human epidermal growth factor receptor 2. This really was a smart kind of development of a targeted drug. This is why we call it the first targeted therapy in breast cancer, even though I told you tamoxifen against estrogen receptor technically was, because we found out that HER2 on the 20 to 25% of breast cancers that overexpress it was bad. It was associated with increased cell growth and division and spread, and a drug was made to specifically shut that down. So that was a targeted therapy. So Herceptin, or trastuzumab, a monoclonal antibody, was the first HER2 targeted therapy. We currently have 4 FDA-approved drugs with HER2 as a target that are shown on the slide. Lapatinib or Tyker, pertuzumab or Perjeta, and TDM1, which is basically Herceptin linked to chemo. It's like the magic bullet approach. You know, you take an antibody, it binds the cancer cell, and the chemo gets inside the cancer cell and not the rest of the tissues. And so TDM1, also called Kadcyla, was just recently approved. And then this is a slide just to kind of overwhelm you with this is only a subset of the different targets that are possible, that there are either drugs approved or in development that are found on cancers. Okay, so lots and lots of targets. You know, as we said, we entered the targeted era, you know, a bit more than 10 years ago. And I like this one here, the death receptor. That's a good one. Okay, so between 1998 and 2003, during the Clinton administration, we had a doubling of U.S. biomedical research budget, and that really expanded cancer research. And in 2003, scientists actually announced that they had decoded the whole human genome. Okay, so chromosomes, the human genome, a direct result of a national investment in more funding for research, healthcare research. In 2003, interestingly, not that long ago, obesity was pinpointed as a cause of many cancers. And then in 2004, the aromatase inhibitors were first approved in breast cancer. And also in 2004, the first drug that was approved for cancer, but it didn't directly affect the cancer cell, it affected the cancer environment, was approved. And that was bevacizumab or Avastin, which is an anti-angiogenic. That means it blocks the tumor cell's ability to bring blood vessels into it, and by not allowing the cancer cell to bring blood vessels in it, you can't bring in oxygen or glucose or, you know, anything that the cancer cell needs to survive. So this was kind of a new concept of targeting the cancer environment instead of the cancer cell directly. And this shows a blood vessel in red and cancer cells, and then some of the surrounding cells that you could target. And so targeting the cancer environment, of which more recently we've been even focused on the immune cells that are in the environment of the cancer, was kind of a new concept within the last decade. In 2005, 2 large trials showed that a low-fat diet and regular exercise reduced recurrences in breast cancer patients. This was a full 10 years after Team Survivor Northwest was founded, by the way. Maybe we were a little ahead of our time. And in 2005, there was a launch of trying to map the cancer genome. So I told you that previously we had mapped the normal human genome, but mapping the cancer genome means taking actually each individual cancer and mapping it and seeing what is abnormal, mutated, lost, added in the specific cancer to see why it is a cancer. So you compare the normal human genome to what the cancer cell has, and you find the differences. So that's mapping the cancer genome. What is it that turned this normal cell into a cancer cell? Okay, that's very different because you have to do it on a cancer-by-cancer basis. So all cancers are due to changes in the chromosomes, in the DNA, and that can be due to external exposures like chemicals and radiation that you get mistakes in the DNA. It can be due to viruses and bacteria. It can be due to hereditary causes or internal exposures such as our own hormones. But whatever the influences that causes the mistake in our DNA, that then leads to a cancer. And usually we need several mistakes, not just one mistake. And this is what we call a genomic profiling heat map. So this bunch of red and green dots is a bunch of tumors. So there might be, 100 tumors on the x-axis there, and on the y-axis are the individual genes. So the genes that we know are most likely to be aberrant in cancer. And if it's red, that means the gene is turned up compared to normal in cancer. And if it's green, it means it's normal to reduce. So you combine these subsets of cancer. These are all breast cancers. And you can see there are patterns, though. So while each cancer might be different, there are at least patterns where there are maybe 4 or 5 different subsets of breast cancer if you look across a bigger group of genes. So this is where we're going. We've now entered the genomic era. Okay, this is where we're going to be going. And right now, we haven't really moved this, and I'm a breast cancer doc, so I know breast cancer best. We haven't really moved it as much into the treatment of early stage disease at the detailed, genomics. I mean, for a long time in breast cancer, we've tested for estrogen receptor and HER2 and made decisions of therapy based on that. But this is getting into the details of it. But in the metastatic setting now for many cancers, we're sending off a block of the tumor, we're testing it for hundreds of genes, and we're looking at least at the drugs we now have approved or those in clinical trials and how we can better match those up. And so we've entered the genomic era. And we know that it takes several genetic changes to take a normal cell all the way to a cancer cell, and that a better understanding of the genes and proteins associated with cancer are going to lead to better treatment strategies. Okay? This is where we are right now. Now in 2005, again, 10 years after we founded Team Survivor Northwest, we actually had a big report issued that shed light on the long-term health problems of cancer survivors. I mean, really, cancer survivorship wasn't even, accepted as something that should be a focus of research or our attention. Up until about 10 years ago, when we had a big report issued that was commissioned by our Institute of Medicine in the US, and it was called From Cancer Patient to Cancer Survivor, Lost in Transition. And basically it said we were doing a really horrible, we did a pretty good job, maybe, of the treatment part, but then we were doing a horrible job after that. That wasn't until 2005 that this came on our radar screen. And I put a link here because I think this is a nice piece that you can download, a PDF of ASCO, the American Society of Clinical Oncology, answers on cancer survivorship. This is a nice piece of information. And I think that the cancer.net website, which is the patient website of the American Society of Clinical Oncology, has really great trusted information. It's reviewed by healthcare professionals, so it's a good resource. So, moving up to 2006, that's when the first human papillomavirus vaccine was approved to prevent cervical cancer. So that was 9 years ago now. And I don't even want to get into the fact that most other countries are doing much better at this vaccine than others compared to the US, but we have the whole anti-vaccine movement. Cervical cancer is a leading killer in parts of sub-Saharan Africa and South America and India. It beats breast cancer still. Okay? This is going to be huge in those countries. Because we implemented the pap smear and then HPV testing and everything, our cervical cancer rates dropped dramatically. But they don't have all that screening in many parts of the world. So the HPV vaccine will be very helpful at saving lives in a lot of parts of the world. In 2007, diet and exercise were shown to reduce colon cancer recurrence, okay, pretty definitively. In 2010, we had the first studies showing that low-dose CT scans screening for lung cancer in heavy smokers could save lives. So that's now for a subset of the population who, depending on their age and their smoking history, we would actually recommend CT screening for lung cancer. We should also try to get everybody to stop smoking, but this is making a difference. In 2010, we had an immunotherapy drug, ipilimumab, that was shown to improve survival in melanoma. Okay, and we have all these covers of our journals and everything saying, you know, immunotherapy, breakthrough of the year, T cells on the attack, scientists prime the immune system as a powerful cancer weapon. And this is just in the last few years. And there are a lot of drugs that have either just been approved or are in development that are trying to help us harness our own immune system in fighting the cancer. We've been trying for more than 50 years to harness the immune system to fight cancer, by the way. It's not like we weren't paying attention to this. It's just that finally I think we have a much better understanding of the immune system and the cancer, that we're getting smart about this, and we've really had the first drugs approved. And then between January of last year and last week, the FDA, just in that time period, a little more than a year, has approved 8 new drugs that target either cancer-driving proteins on the cancer cell or molecules on immune system cells that help in fighting the cancer. So we've had 8 new drugs in about the last year. And we had one last week in breast cancer, palbociclib, to help a cell cyclin inhibitor, CDK4/6 inhibitor, to help overcome resistance to endocrine therapy, but it'll have much broader roles. So the FDA has held true to its word on an accelerated approval program in cancer, recognizing that especially in metastatic disease we are not doing well enough, and that we want to get drugs out fast. And so if we prove they're safe with at least good hints of efficacy, we'll let them get out there. And then we need to still do all the detailed studies to show how well they really work and everything, but we want to get it out there available to patients sooner. So we'll take less data, shorter period of time to do the trials, as long as we think it's safe, with some data on efficacy, but we don't need to do, you know, the decades worth of studies to really define the efficacy. That we can get it approved, get access to patients, and then we're still going to do those studies. So it's really a different approach. And then in 2015, we have a record number of Americans surviving cancer. We have 14.5 million cancer survivors alive in the U.S., and a few of them, I copied this off the Facebook page, are from yesterday, are here. So this was Friday night, I think, after you guys got here. Yeah. So that's the timeline of cancer history. And then I wanted to just spend a little bit more time going into the Team Survivor Northwest timeline. I told you Team Survivor Northwest was founded in 1995. Lisa Talbot, who was an exercise therapist, and I were the co-founders. Sally Edwards, who's on the right in this picture, was an Ironman triathlete. She was the spokeswoman for the Danskin Women's Triathlon Series when it first came to Seattle. And she decided that that she needed to have something in it that made feel, you know, not just helping Danskin, but she wanted something to make, you know, other people benefit from her being a spokesperson too. So she said her mother died from breast cancer. So she said to Danskin, I would like, if I'm going to remain your spokesperson, I would like you to, at every Danskin triathlon that's going on in the country, which we're usually about 6 different cities, I would like you to have a group where you give free entry to women cancer survivors, and you help with the training program for them too, and that they're recognized at the triathlon. So it was Sally. Her t-shirt there says, when was the last time you did something for the first time? I love that t-shirt. And actually, you'll note on Lisa's t-shirt, I don't know if there's anybody else in the room who would still remember this. At the time we were forming Team Survivor Northwest, there were 2 women who decided to do a cross-country bike ride to create awareness for breast cancer, and they called it 2 Chicks, 2 Bikes, 1 Cause. And so Team Survivor Northwest, they were starting in Seattle. So Team Survivor Northwest, which we weren't really anything then, we were just forming, we gave them a kickoff. We gave them a big kickoff in Seattle, and we took, it was the pre-digital photo age, and I'm sure there are photos around. I couldn't easily find it, but they're probably somewhere on the 3rd floor. We gave them, a whole bunch of us took off on bikes. with them, and a few members of Team Survivor actually rode, I think, most of the way to Portland with them on their first leg. So that was kind of one of the early, the Two Chicks, Two Bikes, One Cause was one of the early Team Survivor events. So, and here are some of the, what happened was Sally Edwards went to Lisa and said, can you help me find a bunch of women cancer survivors? So Lisa came to me, and Skylar Lindsley, who is the patient oncologist in that picture, she came to us and said, hey, you guys do women's cancers, can you help find some women? So I just nominated some of my patients, you know. And some of them said, really? You think I can do a triathlon? Well, if you think I can, then I guess I can. And they trusted me. But Kathy was the one who was on chemo at the time. And we were sitting there the day before at the expo. And, you know, they were going around the room saying why they were doing this, and we had a camera in front of us, and, you know, she said, you know, I'm on chemo, I know my hematocrit's low, but I'm an athlete, so I feel okay about it, I'm going to do it. And then I was next, and they said, well, why are you doing it? And I'm like, well, I'm not doing it. And Kathy was sitting next to me. I said, I just nominated everybody. And Kathy said, look, I'm on chemo, I'm doing it, you should do it. And this was the day before. So I went out that night and bought swim goggles. And I did it. And I said, I used the excuse of, I'm the team physician, so I have to stay at the back of the pack. Make sure everybody's okay. But that was loads of fun. Here's the swim. There's Mina. And then we've got Julia and Belinda coming out of the water. So the swim, which many of you have done a triathlon now. Here's the walking group. So we allowed a group that would just do the walk part of it so that they could cross the finish line. This was the group that mainly said, really? You nominated me? And yet they all, you know, were proud, you know, across the finish line, recognized as members of Team Survivor Northwest. And then here's a photo of some of the members coming across the finish line at that first triathlon. You can see some of them, I don't know how well you can see it, are bald, don't have any hair, they're doing it on chemo. And then we had a really lovely award ceremony where they recognized all the members of Team Survivor Northwest at the end. And this is that group. And then a woman named Carolyn Price, and I need to find out where she is now. I think she's moved out of Seattle. She was a journalist in the area. She wrote this article shortly thereafter that said, Team Survivor jumpstarts women cancer patients. These women aren't sitting around waiting to die. That was a pretty kind of bold thing to say, but actually it resonated really well with everybody in the group. They were like, you are damn right, I am not sitting around waiting to die. And so she tells the story of Sally Edwards and one of the patients, Belinda Isham, who did that first one. And the interesting story about Belinda is she had pretty advanced stage metastatic breast cancer with bone metastases. She sadly, passed away from her breast cancer, but her doctor wouldn't sign the release to do the triathlon because he or she said, oh, that's too high risk. You might fall and get you have bone mets. You might fall and get a fracture due to your cancer. And I called him up, or her up, and said, she has metastatic breast cancer. She is having fun training for this. This is like one of the best things in her life. Really? And so we signed it. And then at her memorial, 6 months later, her husband got up and said, this is what gave her meaning in the last year of her life, was Team Survivor and doing this triathlon. And so that really locked it in for a lot of us, that this was really important to be doing. So after that triathlon, we said, well, we can't just do this once a year with the triathlon, so we'll create something where we'll have stuff going on all the time, but we don't have any money. So we started some exercise workouts. The UW Roosevelt Clinic gave us one night a week after hours in their workout room, and subsequently Evergreen and a few other places gave us like one night a week. And We had Michelle and Monica and Marissa, some of our first trainers who would help women at those workouts. We started some walk runs. And then somebody got the idea to climb a mountain. I'm not even really remembering whose idea that was. And I actually put 1997 for Mount Rainier because I'm not entirely sure, but it was 96 or 97. It was shortly after Team Survivor Northwest formed that we got a group together and decided to climb Mount Rainier. And we took a film crew with us. And I actually do have that on video, and maybe for the gala, we'll do a cut of it. I have that, and I actually have a newscast of our Como TV did something with First Triathlon too. And I was supposed to have it for today, but the discs that they gave me when they transferred it from VHS were blank. I don't know. So we will have it for the gala. But so we had a group that did Mount Rainier. We probably could have picked an easier mountain for our first mountain. And subsequently, we have done Baker, Hood, Adams, every 2 years. We pick a mountain. I just heard, am I allowed to say?
You're allowed to.
That in the off years now, Paula is proposing that we do St. Helens, which isn't technical, and might be a bit more approachable for some people who don't think they want to climb with crampons and lace X's and all of that. So that'll be kind of fun. So these are just some of the mountain climbing groups. We also got this crazy idea to ride our bikes to Portland. I think that Bonnie and Dana Sigley, who is another one of the founders of Team Survivor Northwest, they kind of got the idea, and so we did a couple times. Team Survivor Northwest officially did the Seattle to Portland bike ride. I think the first one was in 1997. We had a van, you can see in the background, accompany us to try to help do sweep for anybody who only wanted to do parts of it. They could throw their bike in the van and then catch up with the rest of the group and all. So we got a biking group, and Bonnie then really led the biking group from there on out. And then we got this idea to do snowshoeing, and you can see this is our first snowshoe event. A little hand-colored sign, that says Team Survivor. I think we got Cubs or something. I think Sally Edwards was part of a snowshoe company, so that might have been how we got donated snowshoes. And we did the first snowshoe event, and of course we still have an annual snowshoe event. We'll have another one in March, I guess. And then we have the crazy dragon boaters. Woo! Yeah. So this is an early picture of the dragon boating group, but something for everybody. What is it that is fun for you that's going to get you active? So we actually have a member or two of in this picture, one of the early pictures of our dragon boating group here today. And then, many of you won't remember this, but for a while we had a dragon boat festival that was a fundraiser for Team Survivor Northwest, and then we probably lost money on it in the end, because even though it raised money, it cost so much time and effort. But I put this picture in because it's kind of a fun picture, which doesn't, this is the 2001 Team Survivor Northwest Dragon Boat Festival, and so we had a boat of kind of cancer experts or cancer researchers or something in that one. So we got the Mariner Moose I think he called out, so the people in this picture, you're not going to necessarily recognize them, but I'm next to the Mariner Moose. Reiner Storb, one of the original founders of the Hutch, essentially, a bone marrow transplant expert, is there. Mary Claire King, who discovered BRCA 1 and 2, was in that boat. C.J. Taylor, who sadly died after her breast cancer, of ovarian cancer, but she was one of the founders of the Puget Sound Komen chapter, and her husband Bob Day was the director of the Hutch. And then Lee Hartwell, who was the director of the Fred Hutchinson at that time, stands at the end. So we had a pretty prestigious VIP boat. We lost, of course. Even though Reiner was a really good rower. He's the only one. The rest of us had no idea what we were doing. Did we practice? No. But anyway, this was kind of a fun slide to look at. What was the first retreat? I found this is from a brochure of our first retreat, and I can't quite place it because again it was the pre-digital picture age, but it was the late 1990s, and we did a retreat, Team Survivor Northwest and Cancer Lifeline, did our first retreat together, and we called it Fitness and the Healing Journey, a retreat for women living with cancer, and that was in the late 1990s. It wasn't Fort Worden back then. We rotated some other places for a while before we kind of settled on here. And these were just a few pictures I found in my picture slide set of some of the retreats over the years. But we've had lots of them, and I'm sure some of you have pictures of the retreats I don't have. And then I just threw, this was one of my favorite pictures from last year's retreat. Did you call it thriller dancing? Or
We did a thriller flash mob right here.
We did, right here, right before my talk. Yeah. So the retreats have had lots of fun things over the years. And I threw in some pictures of just some of the people who have been important to Team Survivor Northwest over the years. We've got Bonnie, Barb, Julia Kanyas, our first executive director, Monica, it was Monica? I saw her on the agenda this year. She was here, right? Yeah. Paula, every picture I have of you at a retreat, I mean, way before the Seahawks did well at all, you were wearing the Seahawks. And Cheryl, you were also in most of them, and you both are wearing the same Seahawks paraphernalia today. So we've got Nina, Chris Rinn, another medical oncologist who's the co-chair of our medical advisory board, who's been a big supporter. Marissa Perdomo, who lives in Portland now, but she was one of the original physical therapists associated with the group who helped with the training. And Sue next to her, who I think it was her idea to climb Mount Rainier, actually, now that I think about it. We've got Jean and Joan and Nina and Janet Parker and Dana Sigley and a bunch of other people who have been really important in the early days of Team Survivor Northwest. And then I'll just get to why we're doing this. So as a medical oncologist and a physician, there are lots of reasons why having a group like this that can help you lead healthy lifestyles and get physical activity into your life is important. And so there are emotional health benefits to exercise, including improved body and self-image, decreased anxiety, improved social interaction, a better sense of control, improved depression and mood, and better sleep patterns. All evidence shown that physical activity helps in cancer patients and survivors. And then there are benefits to physical health, including improved healing and recovery from surgery, decreased lymphedema, higher energy levels and less fatigue, weight loss or prevention of weight gain, decreased nausea, less pain, and then decreased heart disease and osteoporosis, because hopefully most of you will survive your cancer to get the things that most American women have happen as we age, which are hip fractures and heart attacks and strokes, right? So, we want to prevent those things too.
Yeah.
How much should you exercise? Well, this is the Center for Disease Control's physical activity recommendations. You can go to their website to look in more detail at the guidelines. But they say if you're an adult, age 18 to 64, you should get about 150 minutes of moderate intensity activity every week. Moderate intensity would be brisk walking. Or you can get 75 minutes of more vigorous activity like jogging or running. Plus, twice a week, you should do some muscle strengthening activities, working all the major muscle groups. So this is what the Center for Disease Control recommends. And my comment on this is it's all about the frequency of how often you exercise, the duration of each of your exercise periods, and the intensity of it. So you can vary all of that. And what's really important is the CDC says 150 minutes a week might sound like a lot, but it doesn't have to be continuous at all. You can do 10 minutes when you wake up and 10 minutes when you come home from work, and that's just as good as 20 minutes continuous. We can all fit this in some way. And, so have less time to commit, so I do a higher level of aerobic activity. You know, I run instead of brisk walking, so I get to cut back on the number of minutes I'm supposed to do. So I found a really cool app, and there's probably lots of them, and you may have heard about a lot of this stuff. I was looking at this list of the 10 most downloaded apps in 2014, and there was one called the 7-Minute Workout. Have any of you seen it? I mean, it's free, it's crazy, but in 7 minutes, you do 12 or 13 different exercises for 30 seconds with a 10-minute break in between, and your heart rate's up, and you are working all your muscle groups. You know, it's crazy. And how can anybody say, I can't find 7 minutes in my day to do this? You know, so we have to find ways to get this in our lives. So getting back to the title of my talk, the 20 years of defying cancer, let's look into the future. So cancer care is going to change more dramatically in the next 20 years than it did in the whole past 50 years. I mean, the rate of scientific discovery, drugs being approved, etc., is just exponential. Advances both in health information technology and a deeper understanding through genomics and proteomics and all the omics of cancer's molecular drivers, that's going to transform cancer care. But we need continued investments in cancer research so that we can translate our scientific breakthroughs into actually getting into the patient. And sadly, I told you that we had this big push during the Clinton administration to double our healthcare research dollars, and we did. And then between 1995 and the present, it's stagnant in absolute dollars, and if you adjust for inflation, we have had, this is absolute dollars approved between 2003 and 2014 for healthcare research, and this is adjusted for inflation. So we've had a 23% loss in purchasing power for research from the NIH over the last, since basically 1995. So promising research is going unfunded. I mean, I sit on study sections reviewing grants. There's lots of good research, and we can approve fewer and fewer grants, you know, because we don't have the money. New studies are being scaled back and fewer patients. And this is really true when we look at the number of patients enrolling in clinical trials. Fewer patients are enrolling in clinical trials. And it's not because the patients aren't interested and don't want to enroll, it's that there are fewer clinical trials out there. So we have remaining challenges, and despite all of the important progress to date, cancer remains one of the world's most serious health problems. And we have major disparities in cancer care and survival, both in this country as well as globally. And worldwide, new cancer cases and cancer deaths continue to increase. If you're interested in just kind of looking at the global burden of cancer, the World Health Organization has a group called the International Agency for Research on Cancer. And about every 5 years, they issue a report called GloboCan. So the last one was issued in 2012. And what that showed was that the incidence of breast cancer in 2008 worldwide was 12.7 million. And they're projecting that by 2030, it would be 20.3 million cases of cancer diagnosed worldwide. And for deaths, mortality, in 2008, we had 7.6 million deaths due to cancer worldwide, and we're projecting that by 2030 there will be 13.2 million deaths. And that's with the US death rate dropping, right? And Western Europe death rate dropping. So all of the developing low and middle income countries are going up. And here's what the same website is projecting. In 1970, only 15% of cases of cancer in the world were in developing countries. They had a lot of other health issues that were killing people before they lived to be old enough to get cancer. In 2008, it had already jumped to 56% of the cancers diagnosed globally were in developing countries, and by 2030, we think it'll be 70% of the cancer cases will be in developing countries. So the UN and the World Health Organization have recognized this, and actually they have a global call to action against what we call non-communicable diseases. This is a really bad term because we kind of, when we think of global health, we think of communicable, which means all the infections. And that's what the major efforts have been on lately, you know, malaria, TB, HIV, all that. And then non-communicable is kind of everything else, you know. And so we also call them chronic diseases. But of course, some cancers are communicable, you know, they are due to infections and all too. So what the UN and the WHO are doing is that we had these Millennium Development Goals that we established that were mostly due to basically clean water and food and infectious disease. And those Millennium Development Goals expire this year. So all the UN member nations have been tracking, and since basically the millennium, have been instituting ways to improve their numbers with respect to these Millennium Development Goals. But there wasn't anything about cancer in any of those goals or any of the chronic diseases either. So the non-communicable diseases, the four major ones are cancer, cardiac disease, pulmonary disease, and diabetes. These have been felt to be our next major challenge. Now that we're doing better with maternal fetal mortality and clean water and infection. So the non-communicable diseases are a priority for the UN. So they've set for the next 10-year goal, between 2015 and 2025, a goal of a 25% reduction in preventable deaths due to non-communicable diseases. Okay? And they voted in a global monitoring framework in 2013 that basically the clock starts ticking now, 2015 to 2025. And some of the things that they have pointed out are all the healthy lifestyle things. Because actually the UN and WHO are saying, if we could prevent the cancers, that is much better for the population and cheaper than treating the diseases once they develop. So they've got a big effort on, they're aiming for a 30% reduction in tobacco use, a 10% reduction in physical inactivity, reduction in alcohol and salt intake, which doesn't have anything to do with cancer but heart disease, lowering obesity. They're not even going for, we're going to reduce obesity. They're just saying a 0% increase. And they'll be happy with it, but that's what it says. And then 80% availability of essential medicines and basic technologies to treat the non-communicable diseases. So the World Health Organization has an essential med list, which are mostly generic off-patent drugs. And they're saying that the countries, even the poorest countries, should be trying to get 80% of these drugs available. So we're going to see a big global effort. And then I just put a couple slides in on this because this is another group that I co-founded, this one in 2003, called We Can, the Women's Empowerment Cancer Advocacy Network. And this was developed to try to really take a lot of the stuff that we were doing in Teen Survivor Northwest and kind of promote it and help empower women in low and middle income countries to be doing healthy things and to be part of the solution to cancer in their own countries. So it was developed first for breast cancer, and then we added cervical cancer later at the request of the advocacy groups in the countries we were working in. And it was designed to try to help deal with inadequacies in information in these countries, inequities in treatment and care, and injustice in cancer detection, screening, treatment, and prevention. And we started in Eastern Europe, Central Asia, with our first conference that had about 8 former Soviet countries come to Vilnius, Lithuania. So we brought the heads of the breast cancer advocacy groups all together. And we've had about 15 either Eastern Bloc or former Soviet countries attend these various conferences over the years. We do it every 2 years. And our next one will be this fall in Bucharest, Romania. So these are pictures from some of those conferences. And then because of the Fred Hutchinson's relationship with the Uganda Cancer Institute, the woman who led the UWACASA, the Uganda Women's Cancer Support Organization, they asked if we could do a modified version in East Africa. So we held our first East Africa Weekend Conference in Uganda in 2013. We just held one this past fall in Tanzania. We're getting 10 to 12 countries to attend. And our next one, we're trying to do this about every 15 months, will be in Nairobi, Kenya in the spring of 2016. So I always show pictures of Teen Survivor. And actually, at our Tanzania conference, I don't know if you wouldn't recognize it because it's small. We brought the heads of 2 nonprofits from the Seattle area. Christy Blair, whose nonprofit Wings of Care and raises money for women's cancer research, and Bridget Richardson, who founded Sarah Sisters, which is an African-American support group in Seattle. So they said they wanted to come and see what was going on, so they are in this picture over here in Tanzania as well, to kind of talk about their NGOs and things that we do. So that was kind of fun to have them with it. So I'll conclude with this slide. 20 years of defying cancer. I think you can see that both in terms of progress in how we prevent, diagnose, treat, and then deal with all the side effects and long-term consequences of cancer, we've made strides. And at the same time, Team Survivor Northwest has also been out there promoting the healthy lifestyles and taking charge of the factors over which you have control. And so I'm very proud to have been part of every good thing that Team Survivor Northwest has done over the past 20 years, and I'm really excited to be here at yet another great